Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I am Auron McIntyre. Have you ever been in the situation where you're doing a large press tour for your new book and all of a sudden you get slammed by a terrible bout of seasonal allergies? That's where I am today. I've been talking all day and got everything going on with the allergies. And so if I'm coughing a lot or if my voice sounds weird or if I'm drinking more water than usual. That's why I'm just worn out a little bit from the grind of trying to do this while also having the this overwhelming allergy attack while doing all these interviews. But I am happy to be here. It's always a pleasure to talk to you guys. And of course, today I want to talk to you a little bit about the idea of democracy as a solved metagame. A lot of people may not be familiar with the concept of the metagame, but of course, if you are a gamer, if you're somebody who is very familiar with online games, I think you'll appreciate some of this as well. But I think this is a really important insight for people to grasp because when you're looking at something strategically, you want to understand the number of options you have available to you. And if there aren't a lot of good options available, you need to understand the necessity of shaking up the board because if you continue to try to play losing strategies in a solved meta, then you're going to end up where a lot of people on the right are now, throwing your head against the wall day in and day out, trying to understand why everything that you do doesn't seem to come back with any serious results. So I want to explain the idea of a metagame and what a solved metagame is for you guys. And I want to dive into a little bit about how that might be something we can shift. Also, I want to tell you a little bit about Tony Blinken and his assertion that Ukraine is basically suspended its democracy in perpetuity because we're in a battle for freedom and democracy as long as we don't actually have to vote. Voting is, of course, very dangerous for democracies, as we keep learning over and over again from our ruling elites. So I want to go into that revelation that has been delivered to us on high from our ruling elites now. So, all right, guys, I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about today's sponsor, and then we'll explain how metagames work. Hey guys, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Magic Spoon. Like a lot of you, I have fond memories of waking up at the crack of dawn, excited to watch all the Saturday morning cartoons. Now, mom didn't want to wake up that early on Saturday, who can blame her? And so that meant that we got to pour a bowl of our favorite cereal for breakfast. They tasted great, but of course they were full of sugar and not that healthy, which is why they were a treat. But now Magic Spoon has an alternative to the cereal that you loved that has zero sugar but still tastes great. Magic Spoon has reinvented your favorite childhood cereals to taste great, but now each serving contains 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and 4 to 5 net grams of carbs per serving. It's a keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, and soy-free way to relive those moments watching your favorite cartoons, and it's only 140 calories per serving. And now Magic Spoon has chewy, delicious treats for when you just want a snack. Chocolate peanut butter is my personal favorite, but they have all kinds of fun flavors like blueberry muffin, marshmallow, and double chocolate. So head to magicspoon.com/Auron to grab a custom bundle of cereal and try the magic for yourself. And don't forget to add their tasty treats to the order. Be sure to use the promo code Auron at checkout to save $5 off your order. So get your next delicious bowl of high protein cereal at magicspoon.com/Auron and use the code Auron to save $5 off. All right, so it's going to come to a shock for a lot of you. I know you're not ready for this revelation, but it is unfortunately the case. I am a big nerd. And because I'm a big nerd, I'm very familiar with the idea of competitive gaming. Not so much video games, though, of course, I have played video games, but not really competitively. I have played online games that do have meta games, but most of my conception of the metagame comes from competitive tabletop games. I played a lot of competitive Magic the Gathering tournaments and 40K Warhammer 40K tournaments. And so I want to take the concept of the metagame and explain it to people because I think it's critical to grasp the situation we're in with politics. And you can tell we're doing very serious politics here because I'm comparing it to battling with cardboard and plastic miniatures and possibly video games. But I do think this is applicable. So stay with me, even if this sounds a little nerdy for you, because I think ultimately there is something to learn here. So for those unfamiliar with the concept of a metagame, whenever you play a game, obviously you are playing that competition, that one iteration of the game. But if you're playing multiple iterations of a game over time, we have what was called a metagame develops. And a metagame is when you start looking not just at the individual games that you're playing, but you are playing but that over a series of games, a pattern starts to emerge. And you don't have to be a huge nerd to recognize this. If you've involved yourself in any kind of game, you'll know that there are certain strategies. If you've played football, or if you've watched UFC fights, you realize that there's different strategies that work in certain scenarios. If everyone is playing a certain type of defense, then maybe it's better to go ahead and run the ball if everyone is spread out for pass coverage, or it's better to go ahead and throw long distance bombs if they're constantly trying to play against teams that running is far more popular at the time. The UFC went through different iterations where Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu were critical, and then wrestling became a critical skill, and you had to adapt the way that you understood the application of different martial arts. You went from everyone being like, I can do Taekwondo and karate, to understanding that the metagame of the way that the cage worked and the way that the rules worked meant that these certain grappling arts and this particular application of these skills tended to settle down the wider variety of strategies that you could really train in. And you should really optimize your strategy for the field and bring in specific skill sets. And this is true of gaming as well. In fact, it's very true of gaming. When you're playing a Magic the Gathering deck or a Warhammer 40K army, you might have a particular way that you want to play that, an idea of what you think is good, but it's not so much what is good as in isolation as what is good against the wider field. What strategies are other people deploying? You can have a great strategy that, when you're just thinking of it in the abstract in isolation, but if you're not comparing it to the way that other people are playing their decks or armies or fighting their UFC fights, if you're doing your strategy just in isolation, then you're a fool, because eventually you're going to run into the reality that over many different games, many different fights, many different iterations, a metagame develops, and people who are good at these competitions pay attention to the metagame. They don't just play their particular strategy, they don't just hone their craft. They pay attention to the way that other people are playing or applying their skills, and they go ahead and adjust. They make sure to optimize, because you're never going to have the perfect strategy against everyone. But if you understand the meta game, then you can optimize as much as possible for the likely strategies and applications that you're going to see. And that's going to make you the best competitor. That's going to give you an edge over those that are unfamiliar or have not honed their skills in the meta game. Now, when metagames start, when a game starts, you have a format, right? Like you have a particular way that the things are shaking out. Maybe this particular strategy is being tried over here in the UFC. Someone's using karate. Someone's over here using wrestling. Or if you're playing Magic the Gathering, someone's using an aggressive deck and someone's using a control deck. And at first, there's different ways you can understand those conflicts or those matchups. But over time, the people who are using specific strategies start adapting the way that they play their strategy to the other strategies involved, and you can predict the type of things that they're going to do based on what you're going to do. And so it's not just I need to optimize my strategy, to against these different things that are going to be applied against me, but you can actually tweak your response to their response. You can get these things down in very minute detail and understand the give and take of any given matchup on a regular basis. And this becomes incredibly important because solved metas are a real issue. See, as the meta goes through different iterations, as the meta game goes from being unsolved, it's a mystery, there's a lot of different inputs, people don't understand the intricacies, you're playing out the different iterations, you're finding what works and what doesn't, you're testing the limits of each strategy. There's a lot of variety that can arise because you don't know what the best strategy is, and there's a lot of improvisation and different applications of different skill sets, and so you have a lot of different options. But as the iterations play themselves out on a longer and longer timeline, you start to see things collapse towards a particular decision point. Again, if you want to put this in a less nerdy understanding, you can put this in the UFC. When the UFC started, there's the wide variety of different striking styles and grappling styles. And the cool thing about it was that you could bring all these really wild ways of doing combat together and see, answer all those old questions of, who would win, the wrestler or the kickboxer or the karate guy or the boxer or all these different things. But eventually you figured out that there was a particular mix of wrestling and jujitsu and Muay Thai striking that kind of was the optimal version. And it didn't mean that people couldn't come in with slightly different versions of this. And there's moments when people would break out because they had particularly impressive skill set in a particular area. The guys like Lyoto Machida come to mind, where he brings karate back in a way that no one had seen in the UFC for a very long time, because of the metagame had kind of dwindled everything down to this subset of kind of wrestling, jujitsu, and Muay Thai striking. So there are people that can break through, but in general, all of these things collapse to a particular strategy. There becomes a particular way you should do things. And the more inputs you have, the faster the meta gets solved. So, for instance, I was a Warhammer 40K player for a long time, and I was successful because there wasn't a lot of data. There wasn't a lot of online strategy in the way that there were for other metagames. And because I was used to being a competitive gamer in a situation where things weren't that competitive, I got to use the fact that I was pretty good at this to my advantage. I got to solve these metagames before other people did because I could see the patterns involved in them. But once there got to be more, there started to be apps on phones, and people started reporting what was happening online in these tournaments. The metagames got more and more complex, and they started to get solved faster and faster because it turns out that like 1,000 monkeys slamming on a keyboard will eventually get you Shakespeare. And having more and more data will eventually kind of grind out the perfect solution to how you should be playing any given game. And the same thing was true of Magic the Gathering. It was something that was mostly played on tabletops, and then it had a meta game because people were talking about it online and they shared articles and things. And so that meta developed faster. But once Magic Online and eventually Magic Arena became a thing, there were just hundreds of thousands of matches constantly be playing, iteration after iteration after iteration. And the fact that you always had this data and you always had these people working against each other meant that metagames got solved very quickly. They mutated, and then eventually it became very clear like what the best strategy was, and that got locked in. And once the thing you need to understand about a solved meta is like once the metagame is solved, once all the possible permutations of a game have been played through, and you understand that there's only a few viable strategies that can really break through and win in any given situation, then the game stops being about figuring out the strategies, finding new novel ways to apply different things. And it becomes more about perfection, right? Getting very good at the handful of viable strategies inside that metagame. Solved metagames are actually very bad for instance, for video games and for card games and all these other things, because solved metagames become stale very quickly. People don't like them. There's no variety. There's always a right answer. And that's not what, that's why you're not playing chess, because you want that random element. You want that ability of that flexibility. Chess is another, I don't want to bag on chess. It's another topic there. It's a very complex game. It's more about playing the people, but that's another story. The point is that solved metas are very bad for games because they get very stale very quickly. And so what's happened is that game developers have gotten into this habit of tweaking these things on a pretty regular basis. They shake up things. They don't let one strategy stay too powerful for too long, because if they do, then it only really matters who's good at that one strategy. And there's a particular way to play it, and people get bored of just playing that one strategy to perfection. And so once the metagame is solved, it's all about really just getting very, very good at that one or two things that actually work. And everybody else who isn't capable of doing that ends up kind of falling by the wayside. I know what you're thinking. Okay, Auron, that was incredibly nerdy. What am I supposed to do with this information? Why are we talking about this on the political show? So the reason we're talking about this on a political show is that mass democracy has become a solved metagame. It's had many different iterations. We've seen it, play out over time. There's been different strategies applied, and people have found various ways of winning. There's been different styles and ways that you should approach it, and things that you could do. But we've iterated on this over and over again. Particularly in the American system, there's a particular way that this plays out. But you can apply this, I think, to democracies in general. And so that what this means is that there is a set of strategies that wins and wins consistently over time, that is proven to be the best way to operate inside a mass democracy. And because the meta of mass democracy has been iterated on so many times, and because the way that we should do these things has largely been played out, we know all the intricate details, we know the back and forth, we know what strategies are viable and which ones aren't. We can predict the outcomes pretty regularly. It's if you are willing to view things in this way. It's not romantic. Sorry, but we're doing Machiavellian politics here. It's not romantic. It draws a lot of the mystery out of the democratic process, but ultimately, it is a reliable way to predict results. And when you realize you're in a solved metagame, you understand very quickly that you have two options, like I talked about before. You can get very, very good at a winning strategy, or you can shake up the metagame. And those are really your only two options. And if you keep showing up, and this happens all the time, if you've ever been in this scenario, people will show up to like a Magic tournament or they'll show up to Warhammer tournament, and it'll be someone who's played very casually. And by all means, you should play casually. But if you show up to a tournament where people have gotten very competitive and they're trying very hard, tryhards out there, they're very serious about what they're doing. And you show up with a really casual strategy. You're just like, well, I got a bunch of cards from my dad at some point, or my uncle had these 40K figures, or this is just the ones I liked and I put them together and I want to just play them here. You can have some fun, but you're going to lose. And you're going to lose because ultimately the people there who are more competitive have already figured out the best strategies. And no matter how much you like to play your cool, new, inventive, casual army, or your new deck, or your new build in a video game, if there's a really well-defined meta and the meta is already solved, then you're very unlikely to walk in and just blow everybody away with your creativity. And nobody likes to hear that, because we all like to think that, the underdog's going to come in and win, and, you're going to come out of nowhere with your originality and be able to kind of blow everybody away. But that's not actually how it works. And if you consistently go in with that mindset, you're going to be defeated pretty often. What happens to most casual players when they walk into an intense competitive meta is they quickly either get on board the meta and they learn and they hone and they change and they start playing that way, or they just get frustrated and they fall apart. And I feel like this is what happens to conservatives, people on the right, when it comes to politics. They keep looking at what the left is doing and they keep saying, oh, that's terrible. Those are bad principles. It's unsustainable. It's corrupt. It's anti-American. It's communist. It's all everything we stand against as Americans. And doing that is just a terrible thing. They try to like morally lecture them about the application of their political strategy. And then they do the thing that they've been told is like principled and moral, and we're going to be the individuals for small government and no spending, and here's how we're just going to leave you alone, and these kind of things. And they keep losing over and over again. And they're very confused by this. They're like, how can I lose? I'm doing all the things right. I've got my principles. I've got my cute casual strategy that I'm bringing to this intense metagame. And I just don't understand. Like, why do I keep losing over and over again? This even seems to stretch all the way up to Republican politicians. A lot of people think that all of these guys are completely, just they have these machinations and they're these masterminds, and every one of these Republican politicians is bought and paid for, which they are, but that they're maniacal and that it's all just motivated by their avarice. But I think ultimately a lot of these people believe what they're saying. I think, if I've talked to a lot of people in elite positions at this point, and I'm surprised every time that I come away with like, oh no, they really do believe in a lot of this stuff. It's not a lot of Wizard of Oz, man behind the curtain type stuff. They're not really being puppeted by like super clever forces. They just don't understand that they really have bought in to the losing strategy. That in the solved meta of mass democracy, they have really bought into the losing way of doing things. And that's a huge problem, because if you don't recognize that the strategy you're involved in is a guaranteed loser, and you keep walking in with the hopes of half the country on your back and the money and support of them, then you're going to end up in the situation we're in now. And so I want to go ahead and explain why the Republican strategy, why the conservative strategy is kind of a losing strategy in the metagame of mass democracy. So the problem with democracy, and this is not just a problem with American democracy. This is a problem, and sorry guys, you're subject to a democracy. It's a constitutional republic. Yeah, I know, but you're ruled by a democracy. You're ruled by an oligarchy that manipulates your democracy, but the force that you believe in is actually democratic. Sorry. So what happens is in every democracy, there's always this flaw. There's a dynamic called high and low versus middle. If you've ever listened to my channel before, you're familiar with this, but I'll explain it again just in case a lot of newcomers, people who might have forgotten or not familiar. High and low versus middle is a dynamic that is explained by Bertrand de Juvenal. And in his book on power, which you should absolutely read because he explains the metaphysics of power that are undeniable phenomena that I think it's hard to pretend are not real. And what he explains is that ultimately there's always an incentive for the high, the top, to team up with the low, the bottom, versus the middle. Because the only thing that restricts a ruling class, a ruling elite, from wielding total power is the organic institutions that are built into kind of the competing middle structure of any given civilization. It's the fact that you own your own property and that you can do your own things and you're not dependent on the central government, but you actually have loyalty to like regional leaders and your church and your family. These are the only things that actually restrict the power of the people at the top. And so if you're someone at the top and you don't like that, and you don't really care that much about your country, you're really just interested in power, then rather than trying to negotiate with the people in the middle and, go ahead and figure out how to share power and what's good for them, all that stuff that you're supposed to do, all the stuff that the Constitution is predicated on, the American civic religion is predicated on. Instead of doing that, what you do is you just appeal to the low class. Because the low class don't have anything. They don't have property. They aren't plugged into the institutions. Sorry. In a lot of ways, the reason that they are low class is because they don't have access to these things or they didn't build these things. They didn't invest in them. And so they have nothing to gain from the continuation of the current order. And they would rather see you dismantle that order and give them stuff. And, Bertrand Juvenal is far from the only one to recognize this pattern. Of course, Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America talks about as soon as the people figure out that they can vote themselves money, the democracy is over. So this has been, Plato and Aristotle all recognize this aspect of democracy. So this is nothing new is under the sun here. This has always been the fatal flaw of democracy, which is why you're not supposed to do mass democracy. That's why you're not supposed to give the franchise to everybody. That's not why you're not supposed to let the democracy pick your senators and every other aspect of your society. You're actually supposed to limit it to a very small, narrow band if you allow it to happen at all. But the problem is that there's no incentive for leaders to obey the Constitution and hold to that narrow band of democracy. They would always rather expand out. So what do? Well, they expand the franchise. This happened in the Roman Empire. It happened in the United States. You start expanding it, you give it to one group, you give it to another. You always promise them the moon when you do that. You tell them that, once they have the franchise, they'll get the benefits that the other people have. And then you start getting those people to vote you powers so you can start confiscating the things from the middle and you can pass it out to the periphery. And once you've gone through all the groups inside your country and you've expanded the franchise to them, but you still need to disenfranchise the people in the middle, you can start bringing people in. So you bring in foreigners, you bring in immigrants, you promise them the moon. They obviously aren't connected to any of your institutions because they're literally from a foreign country. So they don't have, the families here. They don't have the communities here. They don't have the churches here. They don't have the established, cultural forces that would push back against the people at the top. And you keep raiding the treasury. You keep pulling the money out from the middle class. You keep squeezing the kulaks so that you can hand out this stuff to the people that you're bringing in. Rome did this by conquering people and then adding them in as citizens. You can do it your own way. The United States has basically done this with its conquer, invade the world, invite the world strategy. However you justify this system, it always ends up the same. The high and the low coordinate to strip out everything that the middle has. And this is what creates the solved metagame of mass democracy. The incentive structure for mass democracy is always the same. Expand the franchise, expand the franchise, expand the franchise. dismantle the middle class, dismantle the middle class, dismantle the middle class, distribute their wealth to the periphery, distribute it over and over again. And the fact that the Democratic Party is built on this formula, right? You should be able to recognize everything I'm talking about, right? What is the Democratic for? Open border, Democratic Party for open borders. What is the Democratic Party for? Redistribution of wealth, mainly by confiscating it from white middle class voters into the hands of minority voters, giving them certain rights, making sure that these people who have been convinced that the Democratic Party is their only hope and their only protection become entirely dependent on them, and demonize the middle class and the middle Americans, the heritage Americans. This is the process, right? This is the entire Democratic formula. I just did a piece on this last week. Like, what binds the Democratic coalition together? Is it Marxist rhetoric? Well, kind of, but really that Marxist rhetoric is just a way for them to hate a certain class of people and fleece them. And so this dynamic is, yeah, I guess it's Marxist, but it's wider than that. It's more than that. It's a dynamic that plays itself out in mass democracy over and over and over and over again. And that's why a lot of people have problems grasping this. That's why, like, this Marxist thing is the natural end of liberal democracies, because they will always devolve, because it's a solved metagame. There's always a correct way to play this game to get power. And it's all the things the Democrats are allowed to do, right? You notice that all of the things that actually win in a democracy are the things that only the left is allowed to do. So, high taxes, confiscation of property, division of people through through specific ethnic carve outs, promising these things to the communities after, gleaning them from those in the middle who are more established. These are all things that are only the left is allowed to do. The right is not allowed to do these things. They're not allowed to push for the interests of their voting base. They're not allowed to confiscate the wealth of other groups and give it to their people. They're not allowed to explicitly advocate for any of this stuff, right? So the right is clinging to their principles, and it turns out all their principles are losing strategies in mass democracy. Now, I don't want to say that, like, oh, well, that just means that the left is morally vindicated. Like, they're not. Like, obviously, the things that they're doing are suicidal for your society. You can only do this for so long, and this is why democracies always waste themselves, which is literally just language I'm borrowing from the founding fathers. Democracies always waste themselves because they always follow this pattern. Mass democracy is a solved meta, especially in our current scenario where mass propaganda and the control of mass institutions is more essential than it's ever been throughout history, and it allows for a much more efficient transfer of wealth and a much more powerful uniformed application of propaganda and managerial technique. And so what we end up is this scenario where there's this giant Leviathan. The left knows how to hold on to it in perpetuity, no matter what the whims of democracy might say. And they just use mass democracy as a weapon wielded to deconstruct and destroy what's left of the American middle class and heritage America, so that they can benefit themselves at the top and pay at their client classes at the bottom. Again, suicidal strategy. It has to stop. We're already seeing the limits of this strategy, but they will keep doing it until they destroy the country. They're not going to stop. They're not going to be like, well, I guess we realize that at the end of the day, this is a bad plan. No, they have the time preference of a fly. Okay, they have bought into the zombie apocalypse. The good news is that this all has to come down. The bad news is that when it comes down, the solution is the zombie apocalypse, right? These rabid, hateful, parasitic classes that have been fed by the Democratic Party will eventually just break loose and tear everything apart as the ability of the Democrats to deliver on their promises kind of subsides. So this is not an ideal way for this problem to resolve itself. And so what the right needs to understand is a few things. One, they need to figure out how they can apply winning strategies. Now, the bad news is that ultimately they can't buy in entirely to the leftist archetype, because you can't just steal a bunch of money from people that don't have it. You don't have the option of having a bunch of heritage Americans, a bunch of kulaks with their farmland and their jet ski dealerships sitting around that you can just steal and give out to all your Republican constituents. So the long-term effects of this don't work. However, you do need to realize some political realities. The Treasury is being looted either way, right? The left is going to steal all the money. They're going to inflate the dollar to the millionth degree. And to be really fair, when the Republicans are in power, they don't really stop this. In many ways, they accelerate it, or at best, they put a little bit of a brake on it. But they are all going the same direction. So Republicans are going to inflate your dollar and steal your money. Democrats are going to inflate your dollar and steal your money. This is going to happen. And so the only question is who's going to benefit. And I know that's not great. Like I understand the problem. I'm not telling you this because this is fun or popular, but it's just true. And so we should probably recognize the facts of this, that this is going to continue. And so someone's going to benefit, and it might as well be you. It might as well be your group. It might as well be people who align with your values and care about your country, and could at least benefit in the meantime from some of these policies. And so that's why I've talked about things like taxing the endowments of the universities and redirecting those funds to free people from the necessity of college educations, because ultimately that does what we'd like to do, which is tax our enemies, take their money, and distribute it to our people who will benefit, people who would be benefited from freeing themselves from the liberal, the seminaries that are colleges. And that's the kind of game plan that we want to have, the one where we can use this dynamic to ourselves. Again, it's not perfect. We can't do exactly what the left do because we don't have this infinite or near infinite kind of middle class to be parasitic from. The left is killing that now, so they're losing it. It's obviously not infinite, but they have this vast reserve of wealth and social capital and credit that they were strip mining to kind of do what they're doing, and that's running. It's dying, and we can't do that. But we can recognize that the process is ongoing, and we can find ways where we can actually take advantage of it. If we just sit around and keep pretending like, well, guys, it's all tax cuts and small government and capitalism and freedom, and that's what it's all about. If we just keep recycling those talking points and that losing strategy and keep going like, oh, the left, they're the wacky leftists are at it again. If we are stuck in that mode forever, we're just going to lose. We're going to get dominated, and we should, because we're denying the truth of the solved metagame that we're in. The other option is shaking up the metagame, right? You can get good at that works in the meta, and that's one thing we should do. We should start getting good at the things that work, but recognize that ultimately those things are doomed. The thing we have now, the solved meta we have now, is disastrous, and so we have to fix it as well. It's not just enough to get good at it, because A, we can't play the same game the left plays forever, and B, no one can play the game the left is playing forever because it's self-destructive. So the other thing we need to do is figure out how to mix up the meta. And the way to start doing that is complicated. It's difficult. I don't have all the solutions to that problem, but it does start, I think, with recognizing the fact that we need to get away from this idea of mass nationwide change. The idea that we're just going to elect Donald Trump and he's going to sweep in and destroy the swamp and the deep state, and that's going to solve everything. I hope all that happens, man. I hope Donald Trump wins and he shatters the FBI and throws them to the four winds. But let's be honest, he was tweeting or whatever, truthing, whatever he does on his platform. He was talking last week about how he's going to build him a new building in Washington, D.C. So I'm unfortunately a little skeptical about the idea that Trump has learned the lessons he needs to learn. But I hope he does. I hope he does that stuff. I'm rooting for him. If anybody wants to, get me in touch with his team to scream at them, I'm more than happy to do that. But ultimately, I don't think that he understands this problem. And that means we need to have an understanding of how we can shake things up. And mainly that means playing a different game. It means unhooking ourselves from dependency on the system as we see it. And that doesn't mean like, running away into the woods and living off of, bark from trees or whatever. But it means getting in a scenario where you control your school board, you control your county, you control the county sheriff. Hopefully, maybe even you have a governor that's super based and willing to say no to the federal government. You start figuring out how to detach yourself from the necessity of mainstream employment, platforming, operating inside the system's financial institutions. You find a way to remove yourself from a system that is entirely dependent on the whims of mass democracy. Because if you keep playing that game, you're going to lose. Like the game is solved. The meta is solved. You can't be better at the meta than the Democrats. You can play some of those strategies better. You should, but you can't ultimately be better at them than that. So you better get a new meta game. Like you better switch up the strategies, because if you don't, like there's just never going to be any victory here. And so I think it's really critical that we go ahead and realize, how much we have to understand the metagame we're in, how the dynamic inside of it has already been solved, and how our only options are really to go ahead and play those strategies better when we can and find alternative games to play when we can. Because if we keep doing what we're doing now, we're only going to get more frustrated. We're just going to keep losing, and ultimately you just kind of get this learned helplessness that's no good for anybody. I also wanted to, before we go, tell you a little bit about another exciting development in democracy. Talk about a solved metagame, man. Yeah, I plan this talk in advance, and then some. Sometimes the news just gives you the gift of a perfect illustration of exactly what you're talking about. So let me bring that up for you real quick. So this is Tony Blinken, and Tony Blinken is of course your Secretary of State. And Tony Blinken is many people believe he's like the shadow president, right? He's like the main force behind the Joe Biden White House, which is obviously not run by Joe Biden, who can't find where he put his shoes down this morning. And he's here talking about what's going to happen in Ukraine. Let me play this real quick.
Working with the government and civil society groups to shore up Ukraine's election infrastructure. That way, as soon as Ukrainians agree the conditions allow, all Ukrainians, including those displaced by Russia's aggression, can exercise their right to vote. People in Ukraine and around the world can have confidence that the voting process is free, fair, secure.
All right, so good news. Tony Blinken has canceled democracy for an indefinite period in the name of democracy. I mean, this is amazing. We've been told that we have to go to war with Vladimir Putin. We have to infinitely pile money, taxpayer money, hundreds of billions of dollars into Ukraine because we have to defend democracy. But to be really clear, we're not going to hold elections. We're done holding elections in Ukraine. And the best part is it's just indefinitely, right? He says, until every Ukrainian can vote. Well, I mean, you've already killed off like the majority of the male population of Ukraine. Also, realistically, any end to the Ukraine conflict is probably going to end with Russia owning parts of Ukraine. They're going to end up taking back some of those key parts that are ethnically Russian. That's probably going to happen. So when he says until every Ukrainian could vote, it's very easy to understand this as we will never vote again. Ukrainians will never vote again. And you notice that he's transferred the responsibility in his very managerial elite way over to all these voting organizations, the international community, blah, 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 which is another way of saying the globalist American empire is going to decide when we will have and if we will have elections in Ukraine, which really lets you know that Ukraine is entirely a vassal state, in case you didn't know that. And it's entirely just a tool of the ruling elites in the United States. It's not a real country to them. It's just a way to harm Russia, to get a geopolitical advantage, to enrich themselves, to keep a perpetual war going. And so we will decide when and if there will ever be an election again in Ukraine. We will dictate that. And it's just a beautiful reminder that democracy is really whatever these people say it is, right? When they say we're defending our democracy, then what they really mean is we're just defending our oligarchy. And we have to go to international wars for democracy means actually we're just going to make sure that we install our favorite dictator and dress him up with an election somewhere. If we even bother to hold the election, we probably we might just suspend democracy indefinitely. Now, to be fair, they're in the middle of a war. I get it. Like you don't vote in the middle of a war a lot of times. I understand that's something that is often the case, but it's very funny that that's the entire point of the conflict. It's the entire casus belli of like why we should be there and why it's worth our money and why we should be supporting it. And obviously, they just don't give a crap about democracy. It's all just sham. It's all a lie. And I want to play this other part because this is really fantastic here, real quick. Let me bring this up real quick. So, Tony Blinken, in addition to declaring democracy over in Ukraine indefinitely, then went and played a show. I kid you not. Here's a little bit of the guitar stylings of our Secretary of State, our shadow president. Here we go. All right, I apologize for subjecting you to that. I know that was absolutely brutal. But there is an amazing, hilarious irony to this. I mean, so basically, the shadow president of the United States shows up to his to this proxy government. You know, he declares on behalf of this proxy government, the satrapy of the United States, that democracy is over. It's suspended indefinitely. And he goes there and plays Neil Young's "Rocking in the Free World," which is the most boomer stuff you can possibly imagine. Just the most the hysterical boomer garbage you can imagine. I'm gonna play Neil Young's "Rocking in the Free World" as I bomb, as I bomb what remains of, of the Ukrainian male population out of existence, or I run them into the bullets of the Russians at least. I'm gonna play this this absurdity after declaring that there is going to be no democracy in perpetuity in this country. That's so insane that, like, Wag the Dog is a movie about like manufacturing war to save a president's numbers and to raise their notoriety and their approval. And yeah, as fanciful as that movie is, like, even the writers in that movie would have laughed in your face if you told them that we would be doing this in the real world. Like, this is real life. Like, the writers would have been laughed out of the room with how absurd this is. But this is now what we do. This is the United States. This is how we run the global American empire. Uh, Playing horrific renditions of boomer rock songs about fighting against tyranny, while literally ruling another nation by proxy, running its young men to a meat grinder, suspending democracy indefinitely. It's a sight to behold. All right, guys, let's go ahead and get to the questions of the people real quick here. 2-Bit Podcast says, "Congrats on the book launch. I've started to suspect that voting, elections, and even the most podcasts are the soma for the masses. Free will is the true is the true threat to the regime." Yeah, 2-Bit Podcast, by the way, great podcast. Had me on over there to talk about the book, so make sure to catch that episode and other episodes. Many of our friends, people who appear on the show, appear over there, so make sure you check out 2-Bit Podcast. And yeah, very clearly, there's a lot of controlled opposition here. There's a lot of fugazi about, kind of what could actually push back against what we're seeing here. And that's why I think it's important to recognize the metagame. It's important to understand the dynamics in play and what can actually make any kind of real change, because it's not comforting to shatter those illusions. But if we don't, then we get stuck here forever. And that's the real nightmare. As you know, people might say it's as the host actually at 2-Bit says, it's the bitter white pill, right? We may not like some of those truths, but ultimately those truths lead us to realizations that are far more helpful and give us an actual solution to our problem. Creeper Weirdo says, "Weird question. What do you say to libertarians that say that you and a lot of the new right are basically just libertarians rejecting the label?" Oh boy, I don't get that too often. I'm certainly not a libertarian. I do not believe in small government. I do not believe in classical liberalism. When I say I don't believe in small government, I actually still think that we should be governed by the local and regional institutions. But what I mean is, I don't believe that small government is just in and of itself an unmitigated good. Like, I would be for blue laws, because blue laws maintain the social sphere of the church and the family and keep the market from encroaching on them. And I think that's actually what combats big government, is those opposing social spheres. So I'm for using the power of government in the short run, in ways that many libertarians would find unprincipled or unconscionable, to prevent the overall totalitarian takeover that happens inevitably once we collapse other social spheres. So, I mean, it's not that I don't agree with some of the libertarian talking points. I think that, a lot of the insights that someone like a Hans Hermann Hoppe, brings are really important. There are certainly aspects of, Rothbard and others that I think are valuable, Mises and such, but I think ultimately there's a flaw in at least the popular understanding of libertarian political theory, and it's that they largely lack a theory of power, and the realities therein. So that's how I would respond. And then Robert Weisfeld with just the $3 super chat. Thank you so much, man. Really appreciate you supporting the show. All right, guys, going to go ahead and wrap things up. But as always, thank you so much for coming by. If it's your first time on the channel, make sure that you go ahead and subscribe. Make sure that you hit the notifications, the bells, so that you can watch these things live. Always great talking to you guys live when you are able to make it. Of course, if you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, make sure that you subscribe to the Auron McIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you have not bought The Total State, make sure you do it, guys. Buy book, buy book, buy book. Make sure that you are leaving reviews on Amazon if you enjoy it. I'm doing a lot of media. I just got done with the great Tom Woods. That podcast will be out soon. Doing a lot more interviews and dates. Buck Johnson, a former libertarian, from those spheres. So if you enjoy hearing me talk over and over again about the book, you have plenty of opportunities to enjoy those conversations. But you should check them out because, of course, guys like Buck and Tom are themselves fantastic guys to learn from. Guys who are plugged into the libertarian sphere, but are also very aware of the problems and limitations there. Thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.